Ham. Mr. Martelli. Ms. Rosenberg. And Mr. White. We have a quorum of the council and Board of Ed present.
Rise for the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you all again for joining us at this meeting. And for those at home, it's really exciting stuff. At least watch the rerun. We will get some business done. I know from our last meeting of the council, there were some queries. So I know there's some deliverables. So with that, I think obviously our one discussion tonight is the Next Generation School Modernization Capital Project. I'm joined here by Tony Perugini, Chairman of the Board of Ed. Tony, I don't know if you have anything to say, or if we're just so excited we'll have staff start. I mean, I leave it up to you.
No, I was gonna say thank you for having us this evening and have us sit up here at the table with you all. It's nice. I don't think I've ever done this in the past, so it's just reminiscent of teamwork that we're trying to get together, both bodies.
Right.
So right. That we're excited to hear what we got to talk about tonight. So that being said,
Terrific. Now, I know last time, Dr. Solon, you sort of did the introductory. If you'd like to do that and you'd like to go ahead, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you very much. I want to thank the membership of both bodies for, as Tony mentioned, your collaborative effort to get us to this point. This is many, many years in the making, and we're excited to be on the precipice of doing something that is certainly very necessary for our school system, but will so benefit our community over the course of a long time. So thank you for giving the opportunity this evening. As you mentioned, Mr. Slocum, there were a few items that were kind of lingering after the last meeting that you were hoping to have some more information around, I guess, and we can chip away at those one by one. And I think maybe the first place to start is the project timeline. So I'm going to ask Chuck or John if they could just kind of walk through. I know they pretty much everything that we are going to talk about tonight, you should have a printout of. The project schedule is this massive multicolor, yet still two font item that we need to walk through. But I'll ask Chuck, if you don't mind.
Okay. Good evening. Good to see everybody this evening. And I may ask John Copeless. We got split up here, but that's okay. To assist here. But does everybody have this schedule here? Just make sure we're talking to the same document here for it. So as Dr. Solon mentioned, we're really in pretty good shape, I think, moving forward. We're right on schedule with how we've kind of laid out the timeline, and I think pretty good shape, very good shape actually, to hopefully file grant applications towards the end of next month, early June, to the state of Connecticut for the two new elementary schools. Obviously, we're right into that middle part of April, and really approaching the critical stages of approvals that are going to be required to submit to the state. We're pretty much complete with our budgets. I know at the last meeting last week with the town council, we reviewed those and talked about the key factors, the cost per square foot, the different escalation models we're looking at, and reimbursement rates as well. Really for the next steps, the real focus is between now and June 30. And there's really, I think, two critical dates. I think this Thursday, Board of Ed is going to be voting for the educational specifications. I think that was already reviewed with your facilities committee last week, if I remember the date already. So those are ready for review. Our budgets are based upon those educational specifications and the programs contained within those. So that's one critical vote that will be required. And then ultimately the meeting minutes will be followed. The next critical date for town council, we have slated for the May 10th meeting. And I think we've reviewed that with executive steering committee, and I believe that's still on the docket. There's really two major motions in there, the same for each school. First, and we talked about these before, are the 3 standard resolutions authorizing the superintendent and the Board of Ed to submit the grant application and enter into a grant commitment with the state of Connecticut for each of the schools. The other one is establishment of a building committee, and that's just saying that you're going to establish one. It doesn't have to be specific people on the committee. You're going to establish one. And the third one is authorization to prepare schematic drawings and outline specifications for that. So those are very standard. There's a form that the state provides. We just fill in the blanks with your name. We don't have to modify that language at all for those. Then probably just as important, the next one is establishing voting to, and this is bond council will draft up this language, I believe, to basically appropriate the funds and basically agree to hold a referendum this fall, after which we have to report the results to the state no later than November 15th per statute. Hopefully it's successful, of course, but you'll have to pass that resolution in order for them to accept the application and put you hopefully on the priority list for December 15th of this year. So really just tonight's meeting, Thursday nights, and then May 10th is really the 3 critical meetings. And then once that's complete, your following meeting, you obviously certify, the meeting minutes. We'll get a copy of those, and Colliers, John, and I will compile all the documents for Dr. Solon and his team to submit electronically to the state of Connecticut, the grant applications. And then once that's done, it's really, I think, about marketing the project over the summer and through basically the end of August, when the town council come back again and you'll actually establish the referendum date. I think we know when that'll be, but I think the formal vote is probably in August. I think Arnett, we got some outlines for that. Having the town meeting, explanatory text in August for taxpayers. And then roughly around that September 1st date is what starts the non-advocacy period. And that's what you'll see it's kind of in black. And we call the silent period or blackout period by statute. I think most of us probably know, but that's the period where town officials cannot use town funding and resources to endorse the project. It's pretty much plain silent, let the taxpayers do their thinking and research during that period up until the referendum. Then hopefully have a successful referendum in November. And if that occurs, that's really when the projects start in earnest. That's when everything's eligible for reimbursement. That's when hopefully you'll start engaging consultants, bringing on architects, hopefully an OPM, construction manager, and then proceeding with the design phase of the project. And ultimately, once that starts, the design phases are approximately 15, 16 months. There's multiple phases in that. I'm not going to go into too much detail. If anybody has any questions, you can ask us, but there's 3 major phases typically in this process. There's permitting involved. Then we'll have to go to the state multiple times during that process to check in. They basically want to make sure we're keeping on track to get to the deadline. If we're on the priority list this December, hopefully by July timeframe, June, July of 2023, you'll get a grant commitment letter from the state if they pass that act. And at that point, you legitimately have a job and you can start getting reimbursed by the state of Connecticut, the reimbursement requests. And then ultimately, in late 23, early 22, we'd be going out to bid. It's about a 3-month process towards the end of 2022. And I apologize because it looks like a little bit might have gotten cut off, but end of 23 would be bidding. Again, it's about 2.5, 3 months to actually go out to bid, do scope reviews with the trade contractors, assuming if we use a construction manager delivery system, and essentially start construction in summer of 2024. I apologize. These things are shifted a little bit, and complete for the fall and open up in 2025. So it's about roughly 16 months to do the buildings, and finish up the sites in the summer. So that's, again, a very rough timeline.
Any questions on the timeline? Mr. Felleber and then Mr. Martello.
Just a quick question. Obviously, the hope is to have that open. if we miss, if for some reason the timeline misses such that we're not open by fall of 2025, 2026, when's the opening?
Fall 2025, John, just confirm that? Yep, fall 2025. Yep.
Right. So just out of curiosity, so if for some reason it's not ready in August of 2025, what happens at that point? Do we just, obviously we don't want to wait, we don't want to have to wait a whole nother year to bring everyone in. Can we still do it during the course of the year?
We could, that'd be very, it's difficult and more stressful on the schools, honestly, because, we're planning, I believe in that first phase would be to redistrict from 5 to 4. So that would be a very painful process. So, we obviously want to avoid it. That'd be something we'd have to discuss of what is the plan B on that.
How about if we stick to Plan A?
Yeah, agreed. So
think
as soon
we
as
can do
that,
that.
the key thing is if that referendum passes, is really having the building committee in place and going, is not waiting a month to kind of get things going, is really getting that going right off the bat. We've seen some districts in the state, they kind of lightly get going and waste a month or 2, maybe 3. Can't waste that time. Really got to go in order to get. Key thing is getting the architect on board. Honestly, getting them on board, start the program, and start the schematic design. Getting everybody else up to speed after that, because they're really the critical path. God forbid if we did do that, we'd have to have a discussion on it because midstream for a redistrict is a big lift, and I think the Board of Ed would want to avoid that at all costs.
I can't even contemplate that. Mr. Martelli.
So on here, I could be reading this wrong, but it looks to me as if we have construction completion November 1st of 2025. So I understand that there's probably some flow in there, but is it possible, do other districts, do they go out to bid for the architect sooner rather than later? Like, why do we have, if the education specs are developed, we submit the grant application to the state, we're waiting, we get the letter in, you said July?
Yep. That
the project is a go. Why couldn't we be out to bid already and have the architect secured with the caveat that we wouldn't be entering into contract with them until it was approved at referendum?
You can do that. We've done that.
Because we could save.
You can save a couple months on that. You can actually do that if you wanted to start that, say like September 1st timeframe.
Right.
You would definitely save.
So we could save like 4 or 5 months. So then,
It's a 3-month process to get the architect on board. Between an RFQ, you have to shortlist down the 4, get submittals, you interview, and all that kind of takes time with the building committee. If you have the building committee established, for that, you can definitely do it. We did it in other districts, and told them, hey, we're at risk. You're going to go through this, and if it doesn't pass, we're not going to obviously sign a contract. That does save time, and that is a possibility.
and it wouldn't cost us anything.
No, there's a little bit of time if, to draft, if we were engaged, say draft RFQ to RFP, it's relatively small. We've done it for less than $5,000 to draft the RFQ, draft the RFP and the contracts and assist the building committee to go through that. And again, if it doesn't pass, you just don't execute. If it does, then you rock and roll, you sign the contract, get it moving, and you do save time on that. So that would be a good idea to, mitigate that.
Good. All right. Thanks.
Certainly, to Andrew's point, you could put out the RFPs, say in September, October. That you could
you
do
can
an
do the RFQ.
exploratory, as opposed to actually assigning somebody.
Well, you could go, so the process just a little, so there's typically a 2-step process: request for qualifications. You're going to get a lot of attention here. We just had a walkthrough for RFQ in Madison. They're doing a new elementary school. I think we had 16 or 17 firms show up at that site walk and just look at a playing field. Very, very interested. You're going to get all of those same firms for these projects, guaranteed. No doubt about it. So there's the RFQ, and then you have to by statute whittle that down to no more than 4 firms. The statute says you can't select from more than 4. So ideally, you could get the qualifications in and have the committee whittle down that short list, and then you can issue the RFP just to those 4 firms. So it's kind of like a 2-step process. You don't want to do the whole entire proposal because you can't select from more than 4 anyways. And that's what we've typically done for most districts.
Does anyone have a question to this before I ask one? Mr. Walsh,
Thank you.
then Mr. Talbot.
So a quick question about when we're submitting the grant. We're submitting the grant based on what the costs we feel are going to be for these two buildings, correct?
That is correct.
Now, we really haven't discussed that much about net zero buildings or any of that kind of stuff, which could increase the cost of it in the future. At what point does that discussion come into play, or does it come into play does it have to come into play before we submit the grant, or does it?
Yeah, I think we want to have a discussion. And I just emailed, I did see some emails come through. I did email the state of Connecticut because there's not, frankly, a lot of schools, public schools that have been built to net zero. We're working on the Mansfield Elementary School. That's under construction right now. That was bid, however, I think it was in 2020. That came in under budget. That was a general contractor delivery system, not a construction manager. So we didn't see with a CM delivery, we see all the trade bids, the electrical, the concrete, the steel. So we could really get a good diagnosis of what those costs are. Those came in favorable back then, but as we've been discussing, the market's it's volatile right now. It's turning around. But I've reached out to the state to see what other districts have been going net zero, because it'd be nice to know what are they seeing for costs, because there's a lot of different systems in there, frankly, that one school I'd be hesitant to base a budget off of just one school that we've had if they have others to see what those are. Key thing with the budget is managing to budget throughout the design. And it's been out, but it's still relatively new.
So even if we don't go to net zero, but we want to do some energy saving things, so those all need to be done before the grant is submitted, correct?
Yeah, for the budget, we've incorporated, so in the details of the budget, if you ever looked in those back pages that we submitted, we did add, I think we added $1 million for let me just bring it up here. I know geothermal, we added a premium, $1 million for geothermal, and that was just a premium. We're not sure how many there's going to be, but we wanted to throw that in there for that in there. And the base budget is silver lead. That's the minimum you have to meet for this building. Photovoltaic panels, typically what we've done is we tell the design team to add capacity for additional square footage if you have a flat roof. If you have a sloped roof, you can still do them, but if you ask our facilities directors, they typically don't like penetrations in a sloped roof for obvious reasons. But in the flat roofs, you just build in the capacity, you put the conduits in, you put the elbows in through the roof, the goosenecks we call them, so you can run the lines through them. You put all the infrastructure in, and then maybe you do a power purchasing agreement, have them installed for free, and you get some of the savings there. And there's a lot of other strategies. I won't claim to be a net zero expert myself.
But you feel with this budget that we have here, there will be a number of energy saving functions in this budget that will help save us some money in the long run, even though it might not be net zero.
Yeah, the building's going to be efficient. It has to be, and this budget is based upon a comparable school that is Connecticut High Performance, which is equivalent to the LEED Silver. And like I said, there is a premium for geothermal. If, for example, if that, say, isn't used, you can use it for other, because we still have to test. You have to do a test well and check the site to see if it's conducive for geothermal for it. But we do have some premiums in there, and we bumped up the site cost. So I think there's some in there. It's really once you get into the design, you get the design team on board and look at all the different measures, and then you do your cost estimating at the different phases. We didn't price it out for specific components or strategies, if you will, to get there.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chuck, on the marketing piece, you've got the two lines, advocacy, non-advocacy.
Yeah.
When when the council was putting together the SMC years and years ago, one of the things that they looked for as areas of expertise was marketing.
Yeah.
We've since moved on from the SMC. So in what you refer to as the non-advocacy period, the September, October timeframe, that is just for council and board of ed, correct?
Yes, any public officials, my understanding, and check with with Jeff D'Onofrio, any public officials, you cannot be using your formal capacity to endorse the project or resources for that.
But you could have members of the public that were advocating for it.
Absolutely, a PAC, political action committee. We've been referencing South Windsor, many times. They had a strong PAC group that went out and supported, signs, Facebook groups, and provided support in supporting the projects, and they were very impactful.
Other than the two calendar items that are on here, has there been any discussion in the past year about what marketing would look like post grant application?
I don't think we've gotten into depth. We talked about that, but we've been so focused on getting the budget, the ed specs done. I don't think we've really dived into that yet at this point.
Okay. So I think that's the
next step. As soon as we get through these votes, is really getting that discussion moving forward. How we go about doing that.
Yeah, because I think that's a critical piece of this.
Agreed.
Ultimately.
Mhm.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I had a question as it relates to the two school buildings and the architects. I'm sure there's plenty of architectural firms that can handle multiple projects at the same time. They probably do it, although they're not necessarily working for the same community.
Mhm.
But is that a consideration as we go down the road? Are we looking for someone with scale to be able to design two projects so they're not going to necessarily be identical looking buildings in one end of the town and one is school A and school B? I would assume there's some economies to that, and we would need to be looking for that, but maybe there's not. Could you just inform me a little bit on that?
Sure. We've done a couple projects with multiple schools, namely elementary schools. Stonington, Connecticut did their addition renovations at the same time. The South Windsor Phase 2 did too at the same time as well. Both of those projects had one architect selected for efficiency because you're probably gonna have one building committee overseeing both. And if you have two architects, you basically have to have two separate meetings to discuss them individually. When you're looking at systems, finishes, your mechanical systems between the schools, you're probably going to specify them very similarly. Lighting components, AV technology, and a plethora of other specifications that when you write one spec, you're typically writing them for your keying systems, your hardware systems. They're going to be the same typically between the two schools. You have two different architects. You have to coordinate those. And we'd certainly recommend probably one architect to
So
do that.
presumably the same would follow for construction management firm. But what about the contractors?
So each of the projects are separate grant applications. There's definitely separate projects in the eyes of the state. They are bid separately. Certainly you're going to have the same contractors, but some of the strategies that are employed in those projects are what they call a combo bid. So if the plumbing contractor, many times they'll be the HVAC contractor as well, they'll submit what they call a combination savings, so that if their combined bids are the lowest, they'll offer a savings back to the owner if they're awarded both of those. Either both, they'll do two of them, both of the trade kind of, say plumbing and HVAC, I'm just using for an example, but also another one if you're awarded both projects because you're in town your mobilization is going to be less. You're close together. So we've seen that from the trade contractor, but they have to be carefully crafted. It goes to the lowest qualified responsible bidder in as long as the bid documents are crafted correctly, which many of the construction managers, if you go that way, in the state have done that. They're pretty experienced with that and have done it successfully in the past.
So in conclusion, we could find ourselves with two contractors, potentially. Do you think that's more likely?
For
that we- construction, like the construction team, they might use similar subs. but
Well,
is it
if
likely?
you go out it depends what delivery. So you have general contractor, which is the typical, you put the bids on the street, you bid them, and a general contractor will bid them. And it's one lump sum. You don't see all the individual trade costs, the concrete, the steel, the site, et cetera. There could be up to 26 to 30 trade contractors bidding these. If you go through construction manager delivery, you actually select the construction manager as a professional service similar to an architect OPM. It's the same rules. You do an RFQ and RFP during the design process, and you bring them on board early. They help you with phasing. They'll be looking at material. They'll be estimating and a lot of other services during pre-construction. But that one firm, if you elect to do so, can serve as a construction manager for both projects, but you may have different trade contractors on each site.
Right.
You may have a different site contractor. You might have the same electrical contractor if they did it, they might have, by luck, just be in the low anyways. But you'll have different, you'll really manage them as separate projects.
Right.
They'll have separate budgets. You'll have invoices for each one separately. Same thing for furniture, same thing for the architect's fees. They'll have to submit invoices separately for each project.
Right. Okay. Well, that's a little down the road, but I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
kind of defines some of the, not the complications, but the details to what any kind of committee, the building committee ultimately gets involved with.
Yeah, there's some advantages
Pretty
going to
heavy-duty
at the
stuff.
same time because,
Yeah.
We've had great bid coverage with those specific projects. And especially new, we received 153 trade bid packages on the one we just recently bid. That's great bid. We had, I think, an average, there was 30. We had over 5 trade packages per trade package, and most of the major ones like your site work, your concrete, your steel, we had anywhere from 6 to 8 bids, which is just unheard of. It's a really good, the bidding climate spoke for that one. I don't think we could have got a better turnout for those.
And before we prep, Mr. White. And then Sam, did you have?
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, a couple of quick ones. The blackout period, just to be clear on this. So I'm in the grocery store. I can talk to anybody about it. I'm not wearing my Board of Ed hat at that moment in time, right? It's like during a meeting, we don't talk about it. But when we're anywhere around town, walking around, we can talk to people.
That's my understanding. I would
So
refer you
confirm it with
to legal
somebody.
counsel on it, but that's my understanding, Tim. Yes.
Okay. So we do need
As a resident, you can say as a resident, I endorse it. I'm going to vote for it. But
sure.
as a board of, in a Board of Ed capacity, I think there's a fine line. It's probably gray, but
No. Okay.
I believe so.
Okay. So we need greater clarity. Let me see. And then the architect selection. Do we know who does that? Is it council, board, collaborative?
It'll be a board, it'll be a committee that's named and
Okay.
formed.
Okay.
Yep. And it should consist of a member of each body, one would assume, and whatever the composition we all decide we think is appropriate, correct? I mean, would that be normal?
Yeah, so it's typically done by the established building committee. And the makeup of that committee, like you said, Tim, I think is typically a cross-section of your community. They endorse having at least 1 or 2 professionals in the industry, whether architect, engineers, contractors, be on board to provide some insight and guidance, and some expertise. A couple lay folks, but also there, you might have a liaison from Board of Ed and or town council, either as a voting member or ex officio, just to report back to your committee. And however many members you want. Typically we see the most effective in either 5 or 7 members. when you get a lot of members, there's, it can get a lot of cooks in the kitchen, if you will, but that's totally up to you. If we had, I think 13 or 11 on our SMC. So, we made it work, but there's a lot of voices in that room, but you can make it work. But usually there's a good cross connection, across representation across the town for those.
Thank you. Yeah, and then the last thing, because I've had people mention it to me, just curious, do we have a pretty good idea on the referendum? Two things, the referendum date, November, and then also one or two questions. Not that any decisions have been made, but directionally. Are we thinking November and one question or two questions?
Well, it's, I would think it's one question. We haven't really talked about that as a council.
Okay.
But I know it's been thought of as a unified project.
Okay.
We don't want one to compete against the other because we can't just have one and not the other. The plan fails. So we couldn't do that. But it will be November 5th, which is the normal election date. Yeah, it won't be a separate date from the normal election. I believe November 5th is the correct date.
November 8th.
November 8th, right.
Okay, thank
Right.
you. Thank you.
I'll vote twice. Just for the record.
Thanks.
Okay. Sam?
Sorry, Mr. White kind of stole my question. I did want to go back a little bit, Chuck, because, from 2 weeks ago, so the establishment of the building committee, whereabouts in that timeline, did you say?
We have that scheduled for the May 10th town
May
council
10th.
meeting.
Okay. And I'm just still in this, I need to see what it looks like mode. So what can we do? Because to Peter's question, it's almost like we're getting that after the blackout period, and that's not going to help us in, promoting and advocating for this.
Yeah, so a couple of weeks ago, we did talk about those, and one of the ideas, and I don't know if I think we have to just confirm how you want to proceed with it. One of the ideas was, okay, do we have an architect develop renderings, for it? And I think we talked about some of the pros and cons of that. We can discuss those if you want, but I think we've all talked about those. One of the ideas we also threw out during that meeting was, would the town would we like to solicit from architectural firms? And this is something I would want to just confirm with your legal counsel, because we don't want to give undue, advantage to any other firms. What I was going to recommend is, do we want to solicit from the firms that we know that will be, probably 13, 14 firms, pictures of completed work of elementary schools, of gymnasiums, cafeterias, classrooms, the typical spaces that you would like to see various samples of, and have them, and they don't have to participate, but it's up to them if they want to participate. They give you the right to use those images to sell the product and market it. And we're talking about, do we compare it to what you have now versus what could be, and have multiple samples, so they're not just buying one specific vision, if you will, for the spaces. And so that's something that I know John and I have been working and reaching out to firms if they would be interested. There's been multiple firms that said they would be interested in that. And in order to keep it as, I think, fair as possible, I would want to get the images, whether it's with the steering committee or whatever committee we put together, just have them select the best images, and then ultimately those would have their branding on it for participating. They can put their logo on it, and you wouldn't know who it is. We put it afterwards and go, hey, you've been, there might be multiple firms. We have 10 different firms throughout the different images, and maybe say 3 or 4 of a gymnasium, 3 or 4 of a cafeteria, 3 or 4 of a media center. So you're seeing different samples of what it could be like. That's one option. I think we could do that relatively quickly in a short time frame if that's the direction town would like to go.
So that would be the task of the building committee to kind of, with you guys.
I don't think you need a building committee to do that. You could, I think, either with the steering committee. I think you could start it with in the Board of Ed. to put that together, it might be a little more expeditious, I think. And I'm sure you have talented students at the high school level that could help us put together, and I'm sure they'd be happy to, help us put some graphic design in there and come up with something nice, nice selling material for that to sell it.
And is there a potential for the 3D model as well, even if it's
Yeah, so
a shell?
I did speak with one architect just to kind of get have a discussion on that.
Mhm.
And what they recommended, and again, it comes down to who do we select to do that, I think is probably we can certainly make recommendations, but we don't favor any one firm. We could potentially solicit multiple firms to give us, 3 or 4 of them. And the rendering wouldn't be, I'll say, a final computer aided rendering, because those get very realistic and very detailed. I think you'd want to get more of an image that would indicate like maybe brick materials, glass materials, gives you a good flavor for what it is, but not so detailed that, hey, that's glazing, that's a rain screen, that the exact type of materials. It just gives you an indication of what it might look like. And that's very subjective, of course. We'd want to talk with them about, get symbols for them. Hey, what can you come up with? I think one of them recommended they can render it in like a watercolor type of vision. I think similar to what Tyson Kim may have done for the middle school, I'm guessing. But we could certainly do that. I think, again, from our perspective, we just want to be fair to all the firms and make sure we're not giving unfair advantages to anybody in that process. But totally up to the town as a collective if you want to do that.
Thanks, Chuck.
Oh, yeah, quickly. So just want to piggyback on Samantha's and even Peter's thoughts on marketing. So at the planning committee meeting 2 weeks ago, the Board of Ed held, Sam had raised, hey, the public by and large has not been to all the site visits that various members have in SMC and seen their schools and seen and walked through South Windsor schools. So they're not going to have a good idea of what they're going to be paying for, right? So the idea was, can we put a design in front of them? Your feedback was not a good idea to put a detailed design, because even if you had the money to do that now and we actually go out to bid and the next sucker that comes in could be different design, look and feel. So I think one of the ideas you brought up, in addition to having a portfolio of past school projects as things that could happen, was to reach out. But I think we need that visual for the general public, just to have a think about what could be. But I think the other part is solicit feedback. I would imagine there will be some feedback from our public on school design, and it'd be nice to capture that somehow. Hence, I'm going to go back to the marketing side of this. So I think we need to, when we're ready to start working on that. I want to go back to something you said earlier in the meeting. So when Don asked about the net zero and, when do we talk about that and when it has to be in by, I think you mentioned, Charles, that would have to be done, vetted, and any budget accounted for in time for the grant application?
Yeah, I think in talking with the state, and as we're going through it, what we at least want to include is that you're going to be entertaining the option for a net zero school in the ed specs. You don't have to say you have to, but in order to maintain eligibility, remember, I think Bob Selmer from the state said you at least want to mention like geothermal, potentially net zero into the ed specs. And I think, I can't remember if we incorporated that language yet.
We did. Remember, we had added some summary language to catch it.
Yeah, exactly.
The reason why I'm asking is if that's the case, then, if there's any budget implications and all that, we need to know by July, right?
Yeah,
Before the grants.
we've incorporated, like I said, the geothermal, we added additional $1 million. It's going to be, again, it's the budget reflects a silver lead building that's required by law. What other, as we go through the budget and in the design process, what other strategies are in there would have to be determined during the design phase of that.
Got it.
Now, how should we add additional dollars to the budget at this point? Again, we only have the one school and that one came in under budget a couple of years ago. So to use that as a model, I would be hesitant to use that as a model. But at the same time, I don't have, at least in my arsenal, data that says, okay, here's the measures and the cost per square foot in a similar building to incorporate this specific measure for, say, net zero. So we'd be really kind of guessing at those, and I don't think we want to
No,
do
agreed.
that.
I was just asking was if there was going to be above and beyond what's currently budgeted and accounted for, that work has to happen between now and,
Yeah, I'm not
kind
sure
of-
what that would be, Tony, to be
Sure,
honest. And,
yeah.
and I think, these budgets are getting up there pretty good right now, honestly. And, with the escalation, we'll have to monitor it. I think, also the design teams, they could get pretty creative.
I was going to say, so in the design phase, that's
they're-
where,
They're
that's
really
where-
savvy, the firms we have.
Yeah.
And that starts to get that out in the schematic design process, that first phase. We're looking at the different systems and estimating them. And as we go through the process, we keep refining that to what systems we think we can incorporate. And then there's also the possibility, what we call alternates, add alternates for bids that we can incorporate. I'm just going to use geothermal as the example because that seems to be the easiest. Providing an add alternate to install the geothermal if the site will support it as a separate cost. So at the day of the bid, how much that system will cost, and the building committee votes, yes, we're going to accept the additional $1 million to incorporate it if it's supported, and if it's not, you don't select it. And the alternates give you more flexibility in your bid process to, it could be on finishes, it could be on, there's a lot of reasons we use bid alternates, but that gives you control and flexibility during the budgeting. Because if you bake it right into the actual base bid, the main part, it's hard to extract that out. It's hard to get those credits back. So get them in as alternates. It's kind of a la carte menu. Yes, we're going to take that. We're going to take that item. Now, whether it achieves, say, a net zero building, or if it gets better than, say, LEED silver, and you get better savings, that's to be determined on that.
Great. Thank you, Chuck.
Go ahead.
Just one more question on going along that. Is there a possibility of getting any additional grants for going that way, or is that not allowed through the state? Because I know there are some companies that might give certain grants for going to that, whether it's solar or whatever. I mean,
Yeah, certainly Eversource, they have, their programs. They're actually our commissioning group in Colliers works with them for rebates, for lighting packages, and I'm not an expert in that, but there's certainly rebates through Eversource that could be
but none of that
applied
was
for.
included in this budget.
No, we wouldn't account for it. If we get rebates later, it's basically a savings at the end of the job. We don't account for those because we don't know what they would be. You have to actually submit to them what's actually installed and constructed at that time.
Marketing is definitely going to be huge in the success of this project. Since you have expertise in the marketing field and what schools were the most successful, I'm sure you could give us a wealth of information on what direction we should go in the marketing field, which would be important to all of us.
Yeah, I won't, to be clear, we do a lot of schools. I won't claim to be a marketing expert. Just to be clear, I'm an engineer, but we do have marketing folks. We have a full team within our staff that we've worked with on many different projects in many different states that we would, use as a resource. I think from my experience, what I've learned is each town, each district is different in what, like, say, the social media, everybody defaults to Facebook, it seems. Some districts, that's not necessarily the most successful model. Some like to go to flyers. There's public information sessions. So I think it's really a collaborative process of, in your town and going, what's the best way to get the word out there to get the public interested. Bring them out again. I'm just saying, like I say, not a public hearing, but a public information meeting where we have these visuals. Dr. Sol and ourselves, town council, board of ed members going and just really selling the project and explaining the project. Any, your community groups, we know that's been successful with other districts of visiting those groups to really educate them on the project. I think it's really more educating than it is selling. It's just, what am I voting on and what are we going to get? So.
Yep. Thanks, Chuck. And I appreciate that last comment you made, because I would prefer to think of this as an educational period rather than a marketing period. I don't want to be trying to sell the townspeople on anything. I want them to understand what it is and them to decide what's in the best interest of the community. I don't like the word marketing personally, but that's semantics. I do want to explore two things, because I think it's important to understand this and talk about it a little bit more. We have two risk issues coming up in the initial part of this project. The first is whether or not the project is approved at referendum. And we want to make sure the public is as knowledgeable as possible. And if that involves illustrations or other things, and those are positive things, that's good. But we also have to be a little bit careful. And I just want to talk this through. I don't have an opinion on it as to whether or not trying to push an illustration out early, particularly a concept, when it's not vetted through a normal design process, becomes a positive or a negative. You don't want people to voting on a design as opposed to an approach, because the design should have time to really evolve properly through a regulatory process and an evolutionary process. So don't want to rush that out, show a concept, and that concept might not be thought through properly, and that becomes negative in some way rather than positive. And I don't have an answer. I just think we should explore that. But also then the second risk issue is, and I don't know if this is a big risk, I want to talk about it a little bit or understand it. What are the chances of the state not approving us going forward? I understand there'll probably be a lot of applications coming to the state. I think they've been dormant for a while, and there's going to be a lot of competition. What are our chances of getting approval through this process, and what can we do to enhance our ability to present ourselves in the best light so that the state does approve the funding? And I don't have answers to these. I'd like to explore them a little bit so we make the right decision as to whether or not we're put ourselves in an advantage by hiring an architect early and getting that input early, or whether that is better to just be left until after it goes to referendum and after the state approves it, and we move forward in that process. So I know we've talked about it, but I'm not sure if I understand the right or wrong answer here.
Yeah. Maybe we could touch on the state part first. I
Okay.
think that's maybe a little bit clearer, and Jeff, I think has become pretty adept with the state and how they've responded. I think, based upon all the legwork we've done to date over the last couple years, working with the Office of School Construction Grants Review, understanding, and yes, there's been, I think we understand there's been some change of leadership there. Their position has become, I think, more structured, for lack of a better term. It's by the book. They'll tell you, we're going by the book, by the statute. We've reviewed multiple times the program. The team that would be reviewing the grant application has responded favorably to the work we've done in the overall, not just this phase one, but the overall program of redistricting, going from roughly 5 to 4, and consolidating, and in the legwork we've done. I think combination of reducing, really dialing in on the educational specification and increasing our space standard ratio. I think we've talked about that before, and really looking at the program and going, what do we need? What do we don't need? What can we cut? I think we've made really good strides on that when we go back to the state, they'll support. I think the percentages that you're at, again, just based upon my experience, and anything could change here, I think you're in pretty good shape on this one. But again, can I guarantee that? Of course not. But I think our conversations have been positive. We've taken all the steps. I think, short of hiring an architect, and the only thing we haven't done is hire a design team to go to, say, a schematic design level, and that's probably part two of a conversation. Is that we've done the phase one environmental site assessments, we've done preliminary geotechnical borings. Again, have we done them everywhere? Not yet. We just, to give us an idea what's there. We've done the test fits. I think our budgetary data is about as current as we can get for these two schools. Again, we just bid one a couple months ago, elementary school, approximately the same size in your same, roughly same geographic area. I don't know how much better of data we can get with a great bid turnout. I've been talking to contractors and our CMs, and they're running in the same numbers we are per cost per square foot. They're like 405, maybe 410. We're showing, 400, just for the building itself alone. So I don't think we're far off there. We've been talking about escalation points with them. Some are using 8% right now, and that's what we would recommend for these budgets. One of us advised we're going 8% through 2023, then bumping back down to 6% beyond that. That's their model. So I think to date, we've done a lot of due diligence, again, short of just going through the design at this point. Jeff, I don't know if.
Yeah, the only thing I would add there, Chuck, and maybe even reframe the question a little bit, is I think we've done, as you mentioned, everything we possibly could to engage OSCGR through this process, to take their guidance, incorporate that. I think we're in a great place in terms of that element. Once they put us forward, what percentage of districts that are placed on, quote, the list don't get funded? Would that be, kind of like what you're asking? Is there a likelihood there? Is there a possibility that happens? And what influences that decision?
Yeah, so I think we have not experienced, once you're on the list that goes to the governor December 15, I don't know of any of them that's been taken off the list.
I've never heard of a school
politically,
not
it's
doing that.
probably not a good thing from that office to take them off the list after the fact. It becomes way above our pay grade at that point, with the state. I think the other thing we didn't mention with your specific need is your schools are going to run out of room here very shortly. Your enrollment's going up, and that is the state, I know for a fact, does not like portables. They do not want to see portables. They want to see brick and mortar. And your enrollment projections are even more so now in supporting the need for additional classroom space and educational space. They see that, and I think that's a very compelling argument to the state. So I think your odds are good, and the homework's there. In the meetings we had, they haven't had really much other feedback of, hey, I think they did at one point recommend, doing a schematic design level. And I think anybody that's in the industry, like yourself, John, and myself, like, hey, if we could do it, yeah, if we could, have the money to do that and keep that architect on board and make that the design. My only concern for you is I think we talked about the positives and negatives of selling that early. Could we keep that design team on board if the referendum passes and keep them engaged? We talked about that at the last meeting. I think Jeff D'Onofrio mentioned, hey, if it's say $300,000 for an SD phase, your reimbursement's a third, so it's $100,000 you'd be risking, out of that regardless. I think that was kind of a valid point and something to be considered.
Well, I would like to continue to consider that only for two reasons. One, if it does help us understand the costs in a more accurate way in advance of the referendum, and also advances the time. Right now, we're looking at the winter of 26.
Mm-hmm.
According to the schedule. It'd be nice to really get in the beginning of the school season in 25. As opposed to that's a whole half a year that I don't know if we could reduce that from the schedule, but that's a significant difference to consider occupancy midway through the year. And it seems like if we moved forward before the referendum with some risk, and I don't know if we're willing to take that risk, we'd accomplish a couple of things. We'd understand more about what we're voting on, and we might advance the schedule. And I didn't know if that affected the state. It sounds like that doesn't have any impact on the state's evaluation of the application. So it would only affect the referendum and the schedule then at that
Yeah,
point.
if anything, I'd help. I think it would educate them from what we talked to them. I think the staff that's there are confined to the rules that they have now. I think they would like to see that. That's what they've expressed, actually. So that's not a surprise. I mean, Noel Petcher, who's the acting director and he's a deputy commissioner, he said, I'd like to see his schematic design, but he's kind of, I think he'll tell you he's new to this process and understanding that pre-referendum's not eligible for reimbursement. That's a decision you would obviously have to make for it. But if we were to go that, I'd really want to have a discussion with them to go, if you go down that route, can we reserve the right to go through the full selection process for the architect, get the building committee going and go through the process and say, hey, if, give us the full price for the full project, but give us the price for pre-referendum now. And can we keep them on board after referendum? And would the state agree to that? I've asked that already. They haven't responded. We can ask them again, if that's the case, because if they develop a floor plan and elevations, cross sections, you don't want that work to go to waste. That's just a lot of money to go to waste. And if we can retain it and hold it and you agree upon it, then, hey, at least you have that part kind of, sewed up. So I'd be willing to reach out to them again and see if there's a possibility of doing that.
If I may, and I know, Jim, you're on the line here. I just have an issue with this that I just don't have the clarity that I need. But how can we get all of that done by a June 30 commitment date to get the budget in? I mean,
You can't do it by June 30. You
Yeah, I
can't do
mean,
it.
there are certain things we can't do and get any smarter before June, was it 30th, whatever it is?
Yeah, you'd really have to get it, I think, done.
I just don't see how
by
that happens.
early August, I'd say, because you have to set the referendum and the actual value, I think, towards the end of August, if I remember the timeline correctly, that I think Arnett put one together.
I think we can modify the budget though after June 30th. Isn't that correct? After we submit it, we can modify it if we have additional information, as long as it's pre-referendum?
I think so. We'd have to check on that, John.
Okay.
I don't want to say for certain, but I think you could. The state would prefer that. I think working with them, if I was to guess, I think they'd love to see the homework done, but they understand the challenges of, the logistics of that at the same time.
So my next follow-on question that maybe Sean can answer, what have we spent so far? We have limits to what we can spend under, up to 500,000 that doesn't require a referendum. Nobody's going to give us those kind of deliverables pre-referendum and keep it under 500,000. We've already committed, probably at least $275,000 to the process so far.
My thought, if you went forward, it'd be a pre-schematic design effort. In other words, you wouldn't get a formal schematic design. It would be kind of half of a schematic design with a limited fee. So, and I don't have the answer here, Tim. I think it's worth exploring if we think there's an advantage from a schedule standpoint and a knowledge standpoint. And that's why I wanted to talk about it. It's hard to talk about all this in a public meeting as opposed to just a workshop, but I wanted to put it on the table because I think it's worth at least kicking it around. So,
well, I just know our timelines, and I'm not trying to keep anything from anybody. I just struggle with how we can really accomplish it, and then fall on the sword when we don't do what they said. That's really my other fear on the other side of that exercise.
The architectural process and hopefully find efficiency in the design and layout. So for example, we are in the budgeting process, multiplying the square footage out to define core space, hallways, things like that. When you actually design the building, you can start to manipulate some of that to find advantages there. I don't want to leave the impression that, we have this budget that's been established, and when we actually get to the architectural phase, it's going to be wildly different than that. This is per my understanding, a really solid budget. In terms of getting ahead of things, there's two separate conversations I think we're having. One is we want to gather some images of elements that exist in every school, right? You have classrooms, you have common spaces like gyms and cafeterias and things to be able to illustrate like a product that we would be not an exact design, but examples of a product. On one hand, we want to move down that path. On a totally separate issue, we also want to start to solicit requests for qualifications, get those folks in, ultimately, through the summer, fall, whittle those down to the 4 RFP groups so that we can hit the ground running as soon as the referendum passes. The alternative question to that is it worthwhile to get a firm in to design a schematic, very rough drawings, to see what sort of efficiencies are there and how that might influence the budget? Are we all kind of on the same page with those three different, ideas? Okay. I guess aside from the timeline, and I know, Jim, you had questions too. The next thing that I kind of foresaw us transitioning into was the piece about Darcy, because that question was raised, and when, I want to honor Jim's question here, and then we'll have, I guess, Vin and John maybe walk through those changes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, just real quick, I just want to make sure I understood the end of the timeline, basically. It looks like we're expecting completion of both schools more or less November 1st, right, of 2025.
Yeah, John, I wanted to clarify. I was looking at it again.
Okay.
We have these kind of stacks, so I apologize. So the fall 2025, I want to clarify, Jeff, we won't, on this schedule, we can't occupy for fall 2025. I do apologize for that misstatement. We'd be finished up towards the end of 2025 and occupancy in 2026, to clarify. So I do apologize for that, because there's no way we can fit it, and it'd be a 12-month process. There's no way we can build these buildings in 12 months. There's no way it could be done. And I think even shortening that, even John, even the 3, there's no way we can gain that. So I do apologize for that, and thanks for bringing that up. What it does, it allows us to finish up the building, through the winter. What we have to do is they call commissioning, and it goes through like the winter months, making sure your heating systems work correct. We go through the cooling months. So there is some advantage of that. We get to do the punch list and really finalize these buildings for the next year. So again, I want to clarify, it's fall 2026 that would be occupying. So.
Okay, so there is no way we could occupy in the fall of 2025. I mean, in September 20, there's just
no. I don't see that happening. We'd have to cut, and that's when I re-looked at it. In order for us to occupy, we have to finish the building, be what we call substantial completion, really by May 31st to June of the prior year, because we have to bring in the furniture. We do final punch list, then we have to move in, and then we need the month of August just for the administration and the staff to unpack, settle everything out, get all our operations going, get your the MDF room, get everything fired up and ready to go for day one. And that takes a couple months. It doesn't take a couple weeks. We've run into that. We ran into that problem in the past, and we always shoot for May 31st is when we typically shoot to have that building turnover, to start bringing furniture, bringing in your phone systems, making sure all your wireless access points are working. There's a lot of pieces and parts that have to get commissioned in order to operate that first day. So yeah, it'd definitely be a fall, and I don't think we could pull that back for fall 25.
But you feel pretty good, even in the sort of environment we're in now with supply chain issues, and the date you have now for November 1st, that's a pretty conservative date now, or is that still?
That's a typical. That's what we'd have to be proactive. Like right now, we're in the midst of building one right now. And if we go construction manager, you have to have a good contractor, construction manager that's managing that process. You bring them on during design and has their pulse on the delivery of that. By the time we get to this year, hopefully that's subsided. Obviously hard to say with that. But what this does, what I like about the schedule, it does give us some flex should there be some longer lead items, and say with substantial completion goes to say February of 26, there's still plenty of time to finish that building, commission it, and move you in for the fall 26. And I kind of like this schedule better, to be honest, because it gives us a little bit of float if you need it, and we're not stressing right into the summer of the prior to the academic year, because it's a bigger stress on the staff and the principals.
Okay, thanks. I think my eyesight's gotten worse over the past year from
Yeah,
looking
mine
at this
too.
chart alone.
Yeah.
Just from this chart.
Doesn't do me any favor.
Agreed.
Thank you. To piggyback on Mr. Jinks's question, so now that there's been that clarification, that means that we'll have to budget in some kind of operational float for 9 months to operate 2 additional buildings. I'm sorry, 10 months. Thank you, 10 months. So those buildings would be completed November 25, and then they would be essentially unoccupied while everything's being tested and moved in and everything like that. Is that what you're saying?
No,
My understanding?
so up until on this schedule, we're showing November 1 for substantial completion. The contractor owns, typically the way they draft it is that they'll pay for all the power into that up until substantial completion, or sometimes it's written when they put the meter on, the permanent meter, and that gets, and then that'll get turned over to the owner. Let me just check double check my budgets. We usually have a line item in our budgets for, okay, I have that with construction. So I put it with construction utilities. We have a utility assessment budget of 50,000 in there. So we could either, there's a couple things we can do. We can either put a line item in the budget for those utilities to pay out of the project, which is probably preferable than putting them in the operating budget from the Board of Ed, for that. So there's a couple of ways we can account for that. It'd probably be about 6 months roughly for that, but nonetheless, it's still, because at a certain point you're going to get into the building, even though we're not teaching, you're going to, your administrators are going to want to be in there, and staff, and really using the building, even though they're not teaching yet. So you're probably looking, as soon as they're done in June, we're packing up, moving them over there. So you're probably looking about 6 months, 7 months for that. But we can handle that. We can either put it in the project budget as a line item for utilities to pay for that, or you can do operating budgets. Totally up to you. Good point.
All right, so 10 months is a long time, Chuck. There's no potential of incremental move-in. So I'm just going back to my personal experience. We incrementally moved in the grades. We had the administration team in, then we had K1, 2, 3, I'm just thinking that we're paying for a building that's not occupied.
If we were going 1-to-1, if it was just Norton going into Norton and Chapman going to Chapman, that's certainly more manageable. But you're going to be redistricting here. And I guess it's a question, do you wait and redistrict till the fall and just move Chapman over there and take them offline? I think with redistricting, it throws a bit of a conversation into that piece for that. But you're really looking at about 6 months. If we finish it in November, we're gonna have to commission it. You're looking December and basically May till June when you're out. Then in June, you're basically taking possession of that building because the teachers got to move. They have to unpack. So it's not really. I don't think 10 months is an accurate duration for that, to be honest.
My real reservation about the idea of trying to move in midway through the year is that point about the redistricting in for staffing. It means elementary students are changing teachers midway through the year in a lot of cases. Not every case, but to Chuck's point, if we just moved Chapman in there, I mean, I think you might be able to. The only place where I feel like you could probably do it is with Darcy. But when you start moving the older students K through 6, that's where I think we're going to run into real issues with having to have kids change to pick up a matter of a couple of months. By the time I hope this is a problem that we have to think about. Right now, I'd just like to get it to referendum, you know?
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, so just one point on that. Chapman is one thing. There is redistricting involved there. But in very, simple numbers, and I don't know what the future holds, but you have 400 kids at Norton right now. You're looking at 600 kids at Norton in the future.
There's redistricting there too, as well.
With the 400 kids at Norton, if they move from one school to another school, I don't see how there's redistricting involved there. And I could be missing it, but that seems to me like that would be a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, again, I hope that's a problem that we can, tackle at some point in the next 3 years, But yeah, I mean, there's a potential for that.
The tough part, and we've done this multiple times, the hardest part is the teachers packing. They have so much stuff. The amount of time to pack mid-year and move and then unpack is extremely stressful on teachers. I would recommend, talking to other districts who've done it. The effort, I just seen it, and we manage the moves. I agree. Do you want to have a building sitting there? But to disrupt them, and it's a big lift. It's a huge effort to pack and move mid-year. Up to you. I mean, from a consultant, we can manage anything midstream. We can move you. We can get a ton of movers and move them right over. It's really, really up to you and your operation and what you'd want to do.
It's really going to be contingent on the timing. We probably will have a better sense of that upon completion of the architectural process, and we go out to bid for contractors and stuff. And then we'll start to have a sense of when will the building actually be ready. I mean, that's several years down the road, and I hope it's a problem that we have to think about.
Yeah. Just one other thing. I'm not convinced that we can't make the 25 schedule. If we had pre-schematic design completed before the referendum and didn't have the architect selection and then completed schematic design in 2 months after the referendum, we shave 4.5 months off the schedule. I think it's worth at least trying to look at it, not giving up on it without at least an effort.
Sounds great. Absent any further questions on the timeline, I know, like I said, there was that question about Darcy that you had.
I think that would be a good,
transition.
that's a great segue, and it's
You wanna start
important.
there, or you wanna start?
It's a part of the conversation, at least with the council last week.
I think John should present
All right,
his
we'll hand
pieces
it off to
first.
John. It's the two blue sheets that you have in front of you, labeled pre-post budget, I think. The copies are behind me.
Good evening, everybody. So as Jeff was saying, it's there's two documents that look roughly like that. Okay, one of them is titled The New North End, with and without the Birth to Three program in PK, which is essentially Darcy. And then the other document is the Darcy Elementary School renovation sheet. So what this is a comparison between these two approaches. Starting with the Darcy Elementary School renovation page. What this is, we have three columns. The two columns to the left are from last year with the SMC committee, where this was a topic of discussion. And that carries both the high range and the low range costs. And on the back side, you'll notice that that is translating to 19.2 million for the high range and 15.2 for the low range. And what we did based on the request last week was to put a probable figure to this scenario, and that is a resultant figure of $18.6 million. So the cost for renovating Darcy, as it is currently, would be $18.6 million. And that is based on carrying a construction figure of $350 a square foot, renovation being a little bit less than the standard $400 that we are carrying under the new costs for the elementary schools. And we are also carrying a 6% escalation fee in this scenario. Are there any questions on that before I go to the next one? Yes.
John,
Tony?
you said the number is 18.6
Correct.
on the Darcy Elementary School renovation?
Correct. It's the far right column.
Yeah, we're seeing 19,142.
I think you have to.
Oh.
The numbers are different. It's 19.1.
I'm
And,
sorry.
On Darcy.
And our contingency,
Oh, okay.
you're close, I just make sure look at the right thing.
No, the numbers are.
Okay, the numbers, I'm sorry. I had a previous one that had the 6% escalation. That's the difference. The 7% escalation, which is
Got
the document you have, thank you, Tony, does have a total figure of 19.1 million. Correct.
And just if I could add to that, when we look at a renovation, we're looking at a 20-year life versus new construction where we're looking at 50 years. So that is the other difference that was discussed with the School Modernization Committee at length.
And if you do a renovation, I mean, I know the new buildings are a lot more energy efficient. Could you get an old building with that kind of, reconstruction to be the similar energy efficient, or will it still lack some areas?
I would say it probably will still lack some areas, to be honest. There are means and methods of attempting, renovations to the MEP systems, to the envelope, in an attempt to, try to create a better, and more energy efficient facility. However, there will, I think, inevitably be some areas that are not going to be able to be addressed based on the fact that it is an existing building, and the extent of the renovations are to some degree limited as to what can be done.
So would a renovation there also, alter portions of the school or eliminate portions of that building that are no longer needed? I mean, or are we're going to stay with the same footprint of that building and ignore pieces of it? Or is it an entire renovation, which is really overstated for the need?
Yeah, the intention would be most likely that you would not be demolishing, a portion or cutting off a portion of the school.
But you're not renovating it all either, or am I mistaken?
You would be renovating ultimately what would be required to meet the program. So
Which
more
is
than
about
likely,
15.
you're going to be renovating most of it,
Okay.
potentially not all of it. But the OSCGR does also not look kindly on cutting off a portion of a building, demolishing it in total. Depending on, again, what the program is requesting, the intention or likelihood is that you would be keeping the same footprint. And that cost is going to be associated with the renovations. You would likely see more level or degree of renovations to some portions of the building than others. But depending on where the design leads, you more than likely will be touching all of it to one degree or another.
Okay. Thank you, John.
Is there any?
Go ahead, Tony.
Oh, sorry.
So this renovate is new, correct? Is that the?
That is correct. Yes, that is the approach.
And obviously renovation, kids will be in school, 9 months to a year, plus or minus. So that will prolong the process to work around that unless we had contingencies to move the kids out to a temporary location for a duration of it. So but that's not factored in here in terms of finding alternate space and leasing space for. But in other words, we didn't get down the path of if we renovated with school in session, kids on site, it's this long. If we're able to do it kids out of the school, it's shorter window. There's cost to that too that we didn't.
Right. Yes.
Really have.
Renovation in an occupied space is always longer duration of construction. Correct.
Thank you.
And more challenging too, to be honest.
And the natural question there is our buildings are already at or near capacity, where do you even put the students when you have to move people around? You'd have to have a significant number of trailers or something. There's just not the space to do that. Or, as we were doing in COVID, looking at alternate facilities, which would, again, require a significant investment to be able to occupy them as a school. So when our committee spent a lot of time looking at different strategies and what made sense from a strategic or logistic, certainly financial perspective, that's why this was ruled out.
So it's my understanding, so when you're saying birth to 3 in pre-K, so that means that the assumption would be we would be renovating the school, the kindergarten portion that's there currently, those classrooms will be moved out into the new buildings that we would also be constructing, so that we would have the new buildings with a renovated Darcy. And then, so as we're renovating Darcy, don't we have some of our most, I guess, the highly needy students in that building? And we're like, the entire purpose of creating this space into the new structure is to create consistency. And you're talking about having perhaps a year or more of like jackhammers going on when some of our students need like peace and quiet to be able to focus and not have weird sounds going on all the time for like a year. Is that my understanding of the sort of the atmosphere that we'd be creating by renovating Darcy?
I don't think you're inaccurate there. And, I kind of snicker at the idea that, the jackhammer is going off and stuff because it's that outlandish. But I think, we look at it from the perspective of a 5-year-old child who, has a very typical development pathway. That's overwhelming for them. But for a student who you mentioned, has more significant needs and sensitivities, it would be laughable if it weren't so crazy, the idea of doing it, which is, again, why we look at it from a fiscal perspective. It doesn't make sense from a logistical perspective. It's on the brink of torture, as you're outlining. It just didn't make sense for the committee to go that route.
Well, I think from the council's perspective, going back in time, maybe it's a year now, I think most of us on the council thought it was desirous to be able to shutter 2 buildings. I mean, without a question. If you can capture and address all those important needs associated with the educated community that's going to be in each of these buildings, and you can eliminate two buildings, I think that's important, especially 2 very old buildings. Now, I'm not suggesting that they're going to go on sale and make terrific rewards back to the town of Cheshire, because there's going to be a new Byron Rondo on the north end or the west end of Cheshire. But by the same token, I think you just can't be lost in space over it. There is going to be some savings by not having to occupy that space.
And that's a tremendous segue, Tim, into what Vin has shared with you, which is that this larger sheet, I'm not sure if you guys have this same size. I can get you this size because it's easier on my eyes. It might be easier if you don't have that.
You got the better,
Yeah.
you got the better
let me get you
copy.
a larger.
Actually, if we could start with the smaller sheet, it's probably a little bit better to talk through. It's the one that has the green column to the far right. It says 5-year operational cost for school modernization scenarios. I'll try to summarize this very quickly. So on this 5-year operational worksheet, you'll see that there's Darcy, Chapman, and Norton are the 3 schools. And I'm just going to focus on the column all the way to the far right, because essentially what I did here is I took the 5-year cost for each of the line items. So in the case of Darcy, what was their actual electric, sewer, water bills, heating, propane, and we switched to propane at Darcy, oil previous to that, and then building maintenance and repairs. So you could see all the way on the far right, the annual average cost to run Darcy just operationally is $133,281 per year. That's been the average, and you could see it's been up and down, but it's pretty close, on a year-to-year basis. Now, Darcy is the smallest of the 3 buildings on the sheet. Chapman is the next larger building, and you could see that the operational costs are $229,000 a year. And then Norton, the largest of the 3 buildings, is $304,000 per year. So when we looked at, what are the operational savings, which is the large sheet, which I'm not going to refer to, I'm just going to try and just talk through this for a second. So if we look at Darcy, there's going to be a series of offsetting costs here. On the one hand, when we shutter the building, we will have operational savings on that building itself, but we are moving the staff to another building. So I'll take the electricity line, and this is modeled out in this large sheet, but the electricity line at Darcy right now is based on, keeping the lights on, some of the costs related to heat, but we're not cooling Darcy. When we move to the new building, we will be cooling the space that those students are in. So even though it's a more efficient new building, we are adding elements that we don't currently have at Darcy. So some of these, as we look at the costs, I just want to be cautious to say, we just have to keep in mind that it's not going to be a dollar for dollar savings because we're moving from an older building to a newer building, because we're doing more in the newer building. With specific regard to Darcy, we are moving from roughly a 29,000 square foot building to a 20,000 square foot space in a newer building. So that would be a pickup. The big savings at closing Darcy comes from not having any more capital investments in that 75-year-old building for the next 20 years. When you build a new building, you're not going to have to do any capital investments for 20 years. Again, we had modeled all of this out when we were working with the School Modernization Committee. The other offsetting cost issue that we're dealing with is increasing enrollment, right? So when we started modeling these out, we knew enrollment was going to go up, but it seems to be accelerating from when we did this work, about 7 months ago. And then the last thing that goes potentially positive for us is in none of our models did we make an assumption for what we would do after we leave Darcy. Would we lease it? Would we sell it? So we didn't have any gains factored into any of the modeling. And so those are all questions that, we can't answer tonight necessarily, but the cost assumptions on this larger sheet kind of reflect everything that I've just said. So I don't want to, belabor the point that we will have some offsetting costs. They're not, and this I think is the biggest point, it's really not that it's not important, and we always try and save money where we can, but it's not going to make a significant difference in the overall costs of the project as we look to repay the bond debt. We did factor that in to the models that Mr. Jascott prepared. So I'll leave it at that and see if there are any specific questions.
So you're making a case for your next operating budgets over the next
I'm really not.
several years, which is fine. It's fine. No, but it makes a lot of sense.
It is what it is,
Yeah.
right? As we,
Of course.
look at, saving costs on one side,
Yeah.
we are still dealing with the increasing enrollment issue.
But we're still not spending the money in 2 places.
Correct.
So
Correct, and we
there is a
are-
difference.
We are taking, two buildings, two of our oldest buildings, except for Humiston, offline in this
Right.
project. And two buildings that do need significant capital investments if we keep them online.
Three.
Well, three,
Well,
true.
you've got the Norton, of course, it's coming down, right, you're right. Don pointed that out to me. I was gonna let you figure it out, though.
Well, two properties that we'll have available to do other things, including selling it if that's the
Right.
decision.
Mr. White.
Thank you, Tim. Have we heard from Yankee or Eversource if gas is possible? We do not have gas at either Norton or Marion Jarvis right now. Is it possible to get it there? And not just simply extending lines, but the capacity available? Have we gotten that from
I have
Eversource
not
yet?
gotten to that step yet. We do have money in the budget for it. I think that was something that we discussed. We added $1 million to each of the school projects for it.
So one of my concerns with this, just to voice it, is if gas is not an option at either of those two locations, that puts us in a situation where, in my mind, we're either going with heating oil, which has a whole bunch of nasties in it, SOx, NOx, all these things. Even with clean equipment, you still have that stuff in the air with the kids, or electric. I mean, the gas isn't going to have all that stuff, but that is the environment, the air, what we've been doing for the last 2 years with COVID. It's all wrapped up in the same thing, the same issue. So I just wanted to put that on the table, that we don't even have a confirmation that we could get gas, which would mean oil versus, in terms of heating, because we need heating.
Right.
So.
Valid point. Mr. Talbot.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On these two sheets, the one, just using round numbers, the one that's the Darcy school renovation, so 20 million. Is that 20 million reimbursable because you're renovating an existing school?
Well, there is I see Chuck is stepping up to the mic.
Yeah, that would have to be determined. If you take the program, the 21,000, and it's a 29,000 square foot building, we have to talk to the state about it, whether they would support that. Is the first one. The second one is you have to do an analysis. You have to hire an architectural firm to do a renovation status analysis. There's like 12 points they have to go through to confirm if we can bring it up to all the codes, mechanical codes, accessibility, et cetera. We talked about building envelope. That would have to happen on that. So that would have to be determined. We couldn't guarantee that you would actually receive renovation status from the state.
So I guess bottom line, I'm not saying this is the way I want to go, but when you look at the 20 million at 33% reimbursement rate and the $11 million difference with the new north end with and without Darcy, it's an $11 million difference. And that 11 million is completely non-reimbursable from my understanding because it is birth to 3 and PK. Is that right?
No, the birth to 3 is not reimbursable. We've narrowed that to 500 square feet in the
Okay.
new
So
building.
most of the 11 million then would be reimbursable.
Yes.
Okay. Question answered. Thank you.
Questions?
I just have one quick question. If you said we put $1 million into for geothermal, wouldn't that eliminate the need for gas or oil because it could heat and cool at the same time?
You typically have a dual system from
Yeah.
my experience. Typically there'll be a natural gas system, and the geothermal is a backup for that, is the way we typically see.
I'm not, I just thought it would do both, but.
Mr. Felber.
Question, speaking of geothermal, how long does a geothermal system generally last? And does it cost $1 million? So you're putting a budget item in for $1 million for a geothermal system. so that contemplates we'd add $1 million to the cost to add geothermal. And that would obviously be in place of oil, if that's what, that's what we were talking about. So I guess I'm just trying to figure out, if you're going to spend $1 million and it has a lifespan of X number of years, and the question is how much, seems to me $1 million is a lot of oil in over, to put into that system. It just seems like, and I realize we may want to get away from oil, but $1 million of oil is a lot of oil. And I'm just wondering how many years would that take to go through oil? And would we spend more in oil, or would we spend more in putting a geothermal system in? What?
So I'll just offer it. So based on my conversations with guys who do it, I'm going to break it down into really simple two pieces. There's stuff that's in the ground, the well drilling, that is pretty expensive.
Right.
And that, my understanding is it lasts for 50 years. There's nothing, it's never getting weathered.
Right.
It's the stuff that's outside that gets weathered. So the other piece of it, which there is some
The
of that.
exchanger and the other stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And that's going to have more, that'll have a cost to be replaced at some point within, say, 50 years.
Yeah.
I've never done it myself, but this is what I've gotten from a number of guys who work in the industry. They just throw that out sort of casually, like it's a given. The stuff that's in the ground.
Right. I'm just curious. I mean, I'm just curious, the cost of that versus the cost of paying for oil. I'm just trying to figure out how that's, are we putting $1 million into a geothermal system when we could do the same thing for oil for half the price over the life of the system? But
No, and that's the exact question that I asked to have added to the ed specs, basically looking at the operational costs over 50 years. Because, I mean, one of the things that we're doing that's been said at the Board of Ed is let's do a new building instead of a renovation because it's a 50-year life instead of a 20-year life. Well, it seems to me that you should be looking at the operational costs over the 50-year life. And I'm not talking about getting into details of every little thing, but at least big knowable costs like energy. I mean, rates can change, they fluctuate, but you have an idea of how much consumption you're using, how many units you're using. So
So I wonder if it's time now to sort of wrap this up, but not because we're tired, but because there was some additional conversation tonight that I think is important going forward. Number one, I believe, is the development of appropriate planning that, was discussed by John and others here. You mentioned it would be very important to be able to develop a process of investigating the architecture world in the summer months, is what I recall you said, which to me leads to a need to actually contemplate naming members of a committee. Now, these are things that I have certain concerns about, but they may be Tim Slocum concerns, but I think they're just things that we need to wrestle with, but in a short order sort of way. So I think those are the next deliverables, and I think also they probably can be vetted maybe more fully within the administrative meetings of the next several weeks. And there may be ways to bring on different points of view into that as that process goes. So I'd like that sort of maybe discussed. I'm not going to be able to attend that meeting tomorrow. But I think that's what I would have wanted to talk about or begin talking about. Is there anything left uncovered? Is there anything else that came out of this?
No, the piece about the building committee, I was looking back through some of our old information, TSKP. I should be able to share some of that tomorrow by the time we meet, and then, can certainly send it more broadly, but is the point of information. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right. This is where it sounds like we are right now, is hashing out decisions around what degree of schematic design would we pursue, if at all? What's the cost around that? What cost benefit analysis? Images around common spaces and soliciting that. I think we, regardless, probably want to go down that path. And then the our RFP or RFP process, we could discuss that with Chuck and John tomorrow as well for the meeting.
But that seems to really also dictate
Right.
that you have a building committee.
Right, yeah, so the
yeah,
building committee
I
is
think that's
kind of the
kind of
linchpin
what
there.
I learned tonight,
Yep.
and at least I think I learned. Just, yep, please.
If you're going to be tomorrow to talk about it, my own opinion, as I think it through and I heard what everyone had to say, is if Chuck's able to look at a schedule that could advance occupancy to 25, then maybe it has more value than moving forward. If that can't be done, taking the risk of spending the money maybe becomes less. It seems like it doesn't affect the state's evaluation, and at least not dramatically, Chuck. I don't know if I heard that correctly, but it seems less valuable to take that risk of putting money out, particularly some of it might not get reimbursed unless we can really advance the schedule. If that's not realistic, and you'd have to look at it, could we really do it? And is it realistic? I know we could put it on paper, but is it realistic in your opinion? That would be helpful to know before, as part of that decision-making process, at least in my opinion, it would be.
And I know for one, I would hate to overpromise. I mean, I think is a risk that, I really want to be very cautious with.
And wouldn't you want it by really June of 2025, not September of 2025, because you'd need some time to get things moving in there and everything. So now you're talking 6 months, 8 months.
You're exactly right. You don't take possession September 1. You're going to take it as soon as you get out of school for that academic year. Principals going from old office 3 days later to new office. We're moving teachers over. They're getting their homerooms. They need really to have the whole summer is very valuable to them. So you're right. You're going to take possession probably even before that. I mean, custodians will probably get in there and start, getting occupied and, stocking the building, et cetera.
Not enough. There's nothing more no more segues. Peter?
Real quick, Mr. Chair, thank you. Sean, for parking lot then, can we get an answer from Jeff as to, and I like John's term of education rather than marketing, what exactly can happen during the September, October timeframe, just to finalize that? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And one last thing, if we can come up with just the dollars expended so far in this effort. I know it's on the back of an envelope in your desk, John. Yep, that's fine. I know it's not hard, but the group will want to see it. Okay, I will entertain a motion to adjourn after thanking our presenters and anyone else who had great questions and answers.
So moved.
A motion to adjourn. All those in favor?
Aye.
Motion carries.